NRA president flew around on private jets with the group's lawyer. Plus, a federal appeals court sends Hunter Biden's gun case to trial. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by founder of the Reload.com, Stephen Gutowski. Reload.com, of course, is where you can go to sign up for a free newsletter to stay up to date on all things happening in guns in America. But starting off with some news and guns, we actually have an exclusive story from you this week, Stephen, about the NRA and what, at least on its face, appears to be a continued pattern of behavior. If you want to tell us what your reporting found.
Yes. So this week I reported on the NRA President, a man named Charles Cotton, who's been flying private with the NRA's outside counsel, and really they're kind of their main legal strategist, Bill Brewer. And they confirmed that that was the case. This has happened multiple times over the last couple of years. It's not clear whether other NRA officials have also taken these private flights with their lawyer or not. The law firm, Brewer Attorneys and Counselors, they claim that this didn't cost the NRA money, that it actually saved them money because the law firm does not bill an additional cost for clients traveling on private flights with Bill Brewer. So, that's the response that we got from the Brewer firm. But yeah, this obviously speaks to one of the major criticisms of Wayne LaPierre and one of the main sticking points in this civil corruption suit that a jury just ruled against the NRA and LaPierre in. Now, obviously, I will say this is a little bit different than that because there were no accusations. The sources that I spoke with who tipped me off to this story didn't say that these were personal flights, which was the biggest problem with a lot of LaPierre's private flights from a legal standpoint, right? It was that they weren't business expenses. That's why he was ordered to pay millions of dollars back to the NRA for which was mostly about his private flights, especially those when he wasn't even on the planes. It was ferrying his family around, and he still billed that back to the NRA. But obviously, it has a really bad look for the group because it wasn't just the fact that some of those private flights were for personal reasons that was a problem. It's also, this is a nonprofit charity, and the average person who supports the NRA gives them like $45 a year, and they're using that on single flights that cost $50,000, $60,000. And we obviously, I spoke with a number of board members. We talked recently about how the NRA board is going to have a number of new reformers because the members voted in this past election to put in all of the people who ran on a reform platform. Now, it's still a minority of the board overall, at least who've come out explicitly with this position. But I spoke to some of them, and they were very skeptical about this arrangement and the cost and whether or not those costs do eventually get passed on to the NRA in some form. So, Brewer has been, of course, the sort of mastermind behind the NRA's legal strategy for the last half decade or so now, and he's been very well compensated for that. His firm has over $100 million to Brewer from the NRA in the past 5 years, according to the NRA's internal lawyer, John Frazier. He testified to that in court during the civil corruption trial, which he also, the jury found that he'd lied on government forms. But it's really, it just makes the NRA look like they're still doing all the same stuff that they have been all along. It led to these these problems.
Yeah, that was certainly my biggest takeaway, is the continued appearance of business as usual, which is sort of a theme that the last few weeks that we've talked about various NRA stories where we're trying to stay up to date on maybe what's going to happen in the aftermath of that jury finding. And everything has sort of pointed to business as usual, with the exception of those, board election results. And I also found that fascinating that all the board members you spoke to seemed pretty concerned, at least at the appearance of these flights, and said that they would like to, look into it further and see, like you said, Brewers folks claim that this wasn't billed to the NRA, but these board reform members say they want to look into that to make sure. And we've seen in the past, we reported a story where the NRA spent millions on private jet travel where it wasn't something they had a contract with. It wasn't like there was a vendor that they had a contract with, but there were still millions in expenses for private charter flights. And so there's a history with this stuff, and it's not something that you can brush off, at least to these reformers.
Yeah. And to that point, so there's these flights that Cotton was taking with Brewer. And look, Charles Cotton is, from everything a multitude of sources inside the NRA have told me, he is trying to become the next executive vice president. He's trying to replace Wayne LaPierre in that position. So he's a very important person inside. He's the current president. They changed the bylaws to keep him as president for an extra term, which created a whole nother issue of internal drama when that happened. But, he's somebody who wants to run the NRA. And, this is a very similar issue to what got the last guy who ran the NRA into trouble. Not exactly the same as I mentioned earlier, but similar. And that 1.2 million that reported in 2022, we had some internal documents that showed it was like several $1 million worth of, I think it was tens of millions of dollars, right, worth of these high dollar payments to vendors with no contract with the NRA. And in that document, there were 2 private flight companies, and that's where we got the number of 1.2 million. You just combine the cost to those 2 private flight companies. And so presumably that's actually on top of these flights. Like, these flights would be separate from those, because this was through the Brewer firm, which they say didn't bill any of this back to the NRA, at least not as an additional cost. People should go to read the story and read the language themselves. The claim is that clients don't fly at an additional cost. I don't know exactly what that means. Is the cost built into the brewer's legal fees in the first place? They're claiming that it's saving the NRA money. So, presumably no, but it's not, people can judge for themselves. And that's where these NRA board members are wanting more documentation on all this. So we'll see if any of that comes out. But this is something where we'd already reported that they were still spending a lot of money, a lot of donor money on private flights, even after the scandal broke out into public view years after, right? 2022 is 3 years after all this, almost 4 years really, because 2018 was the first sign of some of the stuff coming to light publicly. 2019 is when it really reached a boiling point. But, so years and years into it, they're still open, they're still going out and hiring, not openly, because this was a document that we obtained. It wasn't put out as part of what the NRA releases with its forms, but, at the annual meeting or something like that. And so anyway, actually, it might have been, I apologize. I have to go back and look at the story, but this is not something they were publicizing as that they want people to know about. I don't think. And so this is on top of that already, what we had already known. And it seems to have been continued. They couldn't say how many of these flights there'd been or what other officials may have been on flights. So it's entirely possible that it wasn't just Charles Cotton doing this as well. So the annual meeting is coming up next weekend, starts next Friday, actually, and I'll be out there covering it. So we'll see what, if anything, happens. Donald Trump has confirmed that he will speak at the annual meeting. So that's a boon for them to get him back, especially, because they're in Dallas, Texas, which is not exactly a swing state area, I don't think. And so he's taking time out of his campaign, or what's time he has to campaign, to go and do that. So it's a significant thing for the NRA. We'll see what turnout is at the meeting. It's been pretty lackluster the last couple of years, but maybe they'll do better this year. We'll see. But yeah, and then the board meeting where these new board members are going to be seated, I think that'll be the same time frame, and we'll see if anything happens at that.
Yeah, we'll see. And listeners can look forward to Stephen's updates on that when he gets back. Moving on to our next story that we want to talk about is another one from you about the updates in the ongoing Hunter Biden saga and his attempt to try to avoid trial he's facing several charges, but one of them in particular, or a couple of them actually, are dealing with firearms because he both possessed and purchased a firearm as a admitted user of a controlled substance. And an appeals court just decided that he cannot avoid trial, and that's actually going to go forward on that charge.
Right. Now, this was a ruling. It's obviously a setback for Biden, the younger Biden, and I think also President Biden, because it likely means that his trial is going to happen this summer. So, Donald Trump's going to be on trial, but so is President Biden's son. And President Biden's son is going to be on trial for gun charges when his father is a very staunch gun control advocate, right? So that's going to be a bad contrast politically, obviously. Now, I will say that the appeals court here, they didn't rule on the Second Amendment claims that Hunter has brought up. This was had more to do with this failed non-prosecution agreement that he had that kind of fell through at the last second. If people remember that whole drama a few months back, they had agreed to a kind of plea deal or non-prosecution agreement where Hunter Biden had to do a bunch of things, but the whole thing was like a complicated mess, and the judge was not comfortable with it. And then eventually the two sides blew it up, and the prosecutor filed these charges in earnest against Hunter. And so he was trying to get all this thrown out based on that agreement that they originally had. But the court said, essentially, that argument didn't work with the court. And so he's going to have to go back and actually face a trial. He was trying to avoid any trial at all. And that was what seemed to be their biggest concern was, he can raise defenses during the trial, but he can't avoid the trial is kind of where they came down. And then also, I think there was some news even after that where the district court judge in the case threw out his initial Second Amendment arguments or his lawyer's arguments because not on the merits of them necessarily, but on she said they were too vague. They tried to kind of blur the line between a facial challenge where you say the entire law is just unconstitutional. There are no constitutional applications of this law. That's a facial challenge. And then an as applied challenge, which would be this law is unconstitutional as it's being applied to me. Like as you're using it against me, it's unconstitutional. And so I don't think that really affects anything necessarily about the gun aspect, the Second Amendment aspect of this whole fight, because he can come back and make an as applied challenge, which is the stronger challenge in this case. That's the one we've seen win in other courts for drug users who've been convicted of gun crimes related to the fact that they were using drugs, right? So that's where his case stands. Now, he did get a boost, though, from the other case we're going to talk about, right? There's this Ninth Circuit ruling from an appeals court, an appeals panel in the Ninth Circuit actually ruled on an as-applied challenge to the exact same law that Hunter is being charged under. for somebody who has a previous drug conviction. Now, this guy had several previous convictions, not just a drug conviction, or technically Biden didn't have a drug conviction, but he sort of has publicly admitted he was doing cocaine, crack cocaine, while he was during this period that he bought this gun. So he doesn't have a conviction, but there's evidence that he was an active drug user at the time. Evidence provided by, himself in a book that he wrote and publicized,
Right.
And did a media tour across the country for. Probably not the best idea, but regardless, this other case out of the Ninth Circuit is probably going to be a boost for him, right? They ruled that the law Biden is being challenged under is unconstitutional as applied to this other defendant who had a drug charge. He had an evading the police charge. He had he had another felon in possession charge.
I was going to say there's about 5 or so charges, I think, that they uncovered in his previous felonies.
A vandalism charge.
Yeah.
So these were all, the court found that these were all nonviolent crimes. So it kind of gets to that dichotomy we've seen some federal courts make over the felon in possession gun ban in federal law, which it honestly seems like the Supreme Court is moving in this direction too, with Rahimi and potentially taking up range, which is a Third Circuit case that Biden is being charged in the Third Circuit. This Ninth Circuit case is not a direct, precedent case for Biden because it's in a different circuit, but it does help. These things still help. His lawyers can point to this case in another appeals court that's got very similar facts. And if anything, the defendant there had worse circumstances than Hunter. So it helps, but it gets to that dichotomy of violent and nonviolent offenders and whether or not nonviolent offenders are actually dangerous. And that's what a lot of courts have come down. This is not something that has been put into the Bruin test by the Supreme Court yet.
Right.
So the lower courts are making up their own standards and trying to flush out the Bruin test. And there's a lot of different disagreements on this. Most federal courts to this point have upheld the felon in possession charges out there. A lot of them have not gone to this violent versus nonviolent distinction. But some of them have, including now 2 different federal appeals courts.
Yeah, that to me was the big deal, is that it deepened the circuit split, which at this point basically screams for Supreme Court oversight, whether it's they take up range or in Rahimi, we talked about after Rahimi was argued, I did an analysis piece going over some of they didn't really get into the particulars of Rahimi. Most of that oral argument was focused on, the Solicitor General wanted the law-abiding language from Heller to be the standard, and a lot of the justices seem to be more comfortable, as you pointed out, this dangerousness standard that you're seeing some of these circuits. So it very well could be that whenever we get this Rahimi decision, that also could have a major impact on these cases too. So this is very clearly screaming out for Supreme Court guidance one way or another, whether it's next month or in a future case. So.
Yeah, it certainly seems like from oral arguments, and typical caveats should be added here about oral arguments. They're not necessarily predictive of what the court's going to do in a written opinion. But they focus mostly on the dangerousness idea. There was sort of even joking about how Rahimi, this was the guy with the domestic violence restraining order who had done a lot of nasty things, to be fair. Shooting at people, threatening the mother of his child, physically assaulting people. They made jokes about how if anyone's dangerous, it's this guy, this particular defendant in Rahimi. And so they seemed much less concerned about, procedural issues that some gun rights folks had brought up on the case, and much more concerned about trying to suss out this standard of who can and can't be disarmed under the Second Amendment. And a lot of that went back to this concept of dangerousness. And we don't know how they're going to articulate this or what they're going to do in an opinion. but it seems likely that they maybe draw a line on dangerousness with Rahimi. He's too dangerous for XYZ reasons. And then they might take up range, something like that, and say range is a very good candidate, defendant if you're a gun rights advocate, because he was somebody who is really kind of falls into the technical felon part of this law, which is like he committed food stamp fraud in the 1990s. So he basically stole a couple $1,000s by lying about his income. It's a couple $1,000s in food stamps, right? By lying about his income. And he was convicted of a misdemeanor in Pennsylvania for doing that. But because the misdemeanor comes with a potential punishment of up to 2 years in prison, that qualifies under the federal law as the same thing as a felony. Right. And even though he never actually spent any time in prison, right. So he's banned for life from owning guns in that circumstance. And so that seems like somebody on the other end of the spectrum where, okay, how can we say this person is dangerous just because technically his crime fits this definition of felony under this federal law? That would seem to be the clear way of doing it, but it's not. I don't know. That's be my best guess, but we'll see. And that would have a big impact on this Hunter Biden case potentially, and these other cases that have dealt with. There's also a case called Daniels, which deals with somebody who was arrested for having a gun and weed, and charged under the same drug user prohibition that Biden is facing, or that all of his charges stem from, basically. And there was a federal court found that he was not dangerous, and couldn't be. The law as applied to him was unconstitutional. So, we have this other case in the Ninth Circuit came down the same day as this Biden rejection of his attempt to have his charges tossed. So it does strengthen his Second Amendment argument, which is going to be like, if Biden was just another random defendant no one ever heard of before, it would still be an interesting story potentially. But he's the son of the president, who is very much a gun control advocate, and he's trying to use the Supreme Court precedent that his father has trashed to defend himself from gun charges. So obviously the political aspect of all that, I think, is pretty straightforward and will make the case much more salient to the public than normal.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a sort of a fascinating political dynamic. And it also speaks to just how live these questions are in Second Amendment jurisprudence, as we just covered, all these cases popping up all over the country in the wake of Bruin. So We'll certainly stay on top of it as we head into election season. Absolutely.
Now, Colorado, we have some update. There've been a couple of states that we've seen some updates on their gun legislation, some of the proposals that are coming through. And I guess good news for gun rights advocates. A lot of these are failing. And, you're in Colorado, the latest. What's happened there?
Yeah, so Colorado's legislative session officially wrapped up this week. And before it did, some of the big marquee gun control proposals were left on the cutting room floor, most notably the assault weapon ban. Listeners may recall it cleared the House of Representatives in the state. So the first time ever that a chamber in Colorado has advanced an assault weapon ban. But it never actually was brought up for a hearing in the state Senate. We actually had the Senate co-sponsor who at the last minute signed her name on to this bill. She came out 2 days before session ended, or 3 days before session ended, and essentially said, I'm going to voluntarily withdraw this bill because I think we need to have more time to discuss this complicated, very diplomatic kind of way of saying we don't have the votes for it in the Senate. The Senate doesn't want to touch this measure. And so no assault weapon ban. You also saw an insurance mandate. That was another controversial gun bill that was being introduced. That also was left on the cutting room floor, as well as a bill to go after armed security staff in schools, going after things like Faster Colorado. I know, Stephen, you've talked about your time with those folks. Yeah. So some pretty big gun bills failed. Now, several did pass, so it's not to say that gun rights advocates suddenly had this huge sweeping win in Colorado, but it's just interesting to see in a state that has progressively moved further and further along the way in the gun control direction, still find it very difficult to get some of these big bills across the finish line.
Yeah, Colorado, I think, is a particularly fascinating state for trying to gauge where gun politics are at right now, because it's a triple blue state, right? It's passed a lot of these restrictions, even has a magazine ban, right? That was a big controversial thing when it went in, but it's never been repealed. And even with the recall efforts that were successful, they weren't enough to really completely shift the tide of the direction that Colorado is headed on gun restrictions. But they're also not California, right? They're not just becoming the next state to enact every single gun restriction you could think of. And it's interesting to see that happen because the state is still progressively getting bluer, it appears. But they haven't really gotten progressively more aggressive on this particular issue. Not that they have, like you said, not that there's been no successes for gun control advocates, but not as many as you might think, right?
Especially an assault weapon ban, because that's one of the marquee proposals of gun control advocacy these days. You've seen a resurgence at the state level. Washington recently passed one, Delaware recently passed one. So the states are trying. Illinois, you're seeing it come back, and there was just something about a gun ban that I think it was lawmakers were reminded of the 2013 recall elections. When you're talking about hardware bans, that's just such a different animal in this space where it really mobilizes folks that, for whatever reason, don't really get that involved with some of these other lower hanging fruit type of gun control bills. And I think that one of that, that thought factored in a little bit in the fact that it died. I will say, though, that the sponsors of the assault weapon ban have already pledged to bring it back again next year. So this isn't going away anytime soon. But it just goes to show it's not going to be a slam dunk, even if they do bring it back next year. So,
yeah, pretty fascinating. We also had Pennsylvania, another state, maybe more of a purple state than Colorado these days, but the efforts there to pass a number of gun control bills were blocked as well.
Yeah, including a bump stock ban, which is even one that sometimes you might expect could occasionally get a swing Republican to support. And so that is interesting.
Yeah. So, you saw a number of these efforts peter out at the end of the state sessions here. I don't know that there were any huge surprises this legislative session across the country. You saw most red states do pro-gun stuff and blue states do gun control stuff, and no huge surprises, I think, in any of that. Maybe just a little bit with some of these places that didn't quite get across the finish line, like the solvents ban in Colorado. But all in all, the issues remain just as polarized as you might expect it to be, given our national temperature at this point and where things are at in terms of polarization. So pretty fascinating. But what else we got going on?
I would say, speaking of polarization and blue states, pushing the envelope further in blue states, we have a story from the Wall Street Journal in the newsletter this week about a bill that I, quite frankly, have not seen ever introduced anywhere else before. It's to go after, so-called Glock switches, which are attachments that you can either 3D print, or folks sometimes get them from wish.com, these Chinese sites, and they label them something else. And you can attach it to a semi-automatic pistol, a standard handgun, and it fires automatically. But the way that New York wants to combat that is by introducing a bill that essentially bans any weapon that can be modified to accept one of these devices. It's so that would, for those that aren't understanding what that means, that would essentially ban almost all semi-automatic firearms. Glocks, any common handgun would be banned under the terms of the bill as introduced. So that's pretty staggering bill.
Yeah, and at a certain point, it's just kind of a ban on all semi-automatics, because any semi-automatic could be modified to be fully automatic. That's not, that's the nature of a semi-automatic mechanism. In fact, it's a little bit harder to make a semi-automatic mechanism than it is to make fully automatic ones.
Right.
In a lot of cases, to be honest. Once you understand how the mechanism of the gun works, and I think this is the real problem here, is like it reminds me a little bit of there was these car stealing, this issue with stolen cars that had come up the last couple of years, and there were politicians who wanted to like ban Hyundai or some of these cars that were more susceptible to break-ins, or at least that people had spread the word of how you can steal them easier. And it's like, what do you just I don't think it's an effective thing to try. And you're going to get to the point where you're just trying to ban knowledge of stuff. It's similar to the 3D printed gun stuff, the whole fight over CAD files on the internet that happened a few years back, where they tried to ban people from sharing like computer files of gun parts because they could be 3D printed. And it's like, so you're just trying to ban like the knowledge of the concepts. Like, we're going to ban the lockpicking lawyer or forgotten weapons next because they explain how these things actually work. It's not a realistic thing. If you want to ban the way we traditionally handled this is that you ban the process, that the actual action of turning a semi-automatic into a fully automatic, modifying the gun. And so people who use Glock switches, right, they're doing something illegal already. It's already illegal for you to do that unless you have very specific kind of licensing or what have you. Like, there's stuff like drop-in auto sears for AR-15s that, it's not a complicated mechanism. Once you understand how the gun functions, you can see how a semi-automatic disconnector works and how to overcome it. Unless you can erase that knowledge from people's brains.
Men in Black style with a
it's not going to be an effective thing to try and legislate. And then, if you go this path, I mean, you're just banning all. It's very similar to what you saw with bump stocks to some degree. Because you can ban bump stocks. This is what the ATF ended up doing, which is just the physical stock piece of plastic. They just went after that instead of the broader approach, which some legislation have taken this approach of like just kind of trying to ban anything that increases the rate of fire of a semi-automatic, which gets you to like lighter triggers, or you get into all kinds of unintended areas, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. If you understand how these firearms work, you can modify them. And if you want to make the modification illegal, okay. But if you're trying to just make the concept of it illegal, or the base product illegal, I mean, you're just going to ban all the semi-automatic guns. Like you can bump fire any semi-automatic firearm without a bump stock. That's because of how it works. It's just utilizing the recoil in a specific way so that it bumps your finger off the trigger so that you can actuate the trigger again much more quickly than you otherwise would be able to. Like, it's not. And these Glock switches, they just basically interfere with the semi-automatic disconnector in a semi-automatic handgun.
Right.
Now, can you change the design of a handgun to make the specific Glock switch that, one specific type of Glock switch not work anymore? Yeah, sure. Probably you can. But then you just design another one that does the same thing.
Right.
I don't know. So it's a little bit foolish in my mind, but we'll see where it goes. We'll see if it has any. I mean, I think the biggest problem with it from a lawmaker standpoint is that it's almost certainly unconstitutional. I mean, you're trying to ban these guns that have been explicitly protected by the Supreme Court in Heller. So I don't know how they're going to manage that constitutionally. I think this would get struck down pretty fast.
Yeah, I think almost certainly. But the sheer fact that this was introduced, I think, is interesting. It's obviously in a state that has been known to push the envelope on gun laws in the past. So to see if this has legs anywhere will be something worth following as it goes forward.
Yeah, I mean, California and New York are places you want to watch. New Jersey sometimes too for new gun control proposals because that's where they originate, and then they tend to be trendsetters in that regard. So, if this passes in New York, just like the broom response bills, right?
Right.
That was first in New York, and then it caught on in other places. Even some places, even like Colorado, have considered adding them even when they weren't affected by Bruin directly.
Right.
So, they can be real trendsetters on gun policy. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on and watch. But I just think the concept of it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, not a ton. And then the final link we want to hit before we wrap up here comes to us from Politico. And it's just a little bit of an update on the congressional primary race in Texas, where incumbent Representative Tony Gonzalez is fending off a primary challenge from famous gun tuber Brandon Herrera, and sort of the political dynamics where Gonzalez has sort of been a little bit of a thorn in the side of Republican leadership at times, because he sometimes votes maybe more moderately, or for most notably on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was what prompted this primary challenge in the first place. But
yeah, that's what makes it interesting for us.
Absolutely. But leadership is coming to his aid and trying to stave off this primary challenge. And so you have this sort of insurgent gun rights challenger against this guy who voted for gun control, but still has the backing of Republican leadership. And it's just a fascinating political dynamic.
Yeah. And you've seen a number of like the House Freedom Caucus guys have shown up to campaign for Herrera. The Gates and Bob Good have shown up down there. So you've got kind of an inter-party fight going on that's not very common. You don't really see. This has actually been an issue for Republicans this year, this cycle, where they're all kind of fighting each other in these primaries. And it probably just says a lot about where the party is right now. It's a bit more fractured than in previous years, likely because of, there's a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump in the party. And although that's not really what's going on here, right? I don't think you could say Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is much of a Trump opponent, or Matt Gaetz or Bob Good or either of these candidates. Gonzalez endorsed Trump. I don't think Herrera is a big anti-Trump guy. He made fun of Barron at one point, but I think that's just more to do with him being kind of, an online celebrity talking head type guy rather than anything else, really. So regardless of all that, it'll be interesting to see how this comes out from a gun rights perspective or a gun politics perspective, because, him getting to a runoff says quite a bit, because basically it was his primary reason for running was that vote on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So you're seeing a real political consequence for Gonzalez having voted for that, even though he's in a relatively more purple district. It's a suburban district. It's in Texas, but it's not a safe red district. And so if you can see, a Republican challenged, even if Herrera doesn't get across the line, I mean, it still sends a pretty big message to a lot of other Republican incumbents about voting for stuff like that. It's not, like it's just one race. The senator there voted for it as well. The Republican senator from Texas. My mind just blanks. Not Ted Cruz.
John Cornyn.
Yeah, John Cornyn voted for it as well, and I don't think he's still up for a potential replacement for Mitch McConnell. So, I don't want to overstate it, but it is something where you see a specific consequence directly because of a vote for a gun control bill. And so that says a lot politically, I think. And if he wins, it adds another level to that warning to other incumbent Republicans. Of course, if he wins and then loses the general election, it muddies the political message a bit, I think. But yeah, it'll be a fascinating one to watch. We'll have to see where it all ends up. And, Herrera's not like he's an amateur as far as politics goes. So just that he got this far at all is now he has a pretty big following, so I'm sure that helps. But yeah, we'll see. We're certainly going to keep tracking it. I think the runoff is later this month, the end of the month. So we'll have some insights from it when it comes around.
Yeah, we'll have to keep, like I said, we're not political pundits, but this is one of the few races this cycle that's directly tied to guns, which is, I think, is noteworthy in the fact that a lot of these other Republican races haven't been. So like you said, we'll keep tabs on it when it comes down.
For sure.
But as we wrapped up the news side of things, you got anything going on this weekend?
Well, it's my girlfriend's birthday, so I'm gonna take her to the National Arboretum. She likes plants and stuff, so so it should be fun. I think I want to try and get to the range too, do a little bit of shooting. I have scheduled another YAF range day, National Journalism Center range day that's coming up next month, and I've got the Homes for Our Troops charity range day. The winner of this year's auction is we've settled on a date for early June, so I'm looking forward to that too. I think maybe some skeet shooting and some I don't know, maybe I don't know. I might rent some full auto with them. We'll see what they want to do. XCal here in Virginia you can rent full auto now, and that's always fun. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Definitely. So you'll have to give us an update when you take them out.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, unfortunately, nothing fun. I have more work for me this weekend. Hopefully, I'll try to watch some of my teams play in the playoffs. Although the Nuggets have been disappointing, very disappointing so far. But yeah, so work and hopefully not being disappointed by my sports teams in the playoffs.
How are the Avs doing?
They lost last night, but they stole the first game on the road, which is good against a very good Dallas Stars team. So I'm more positive about their chances. The Nuggets aren't looking so hot right now.
Well, good luck. The Phillies still the hottest team in baseball, best record. They didn't play last night, but they play today. So I'm pretty happy about that. Going to enjoy it while it lasts. Maybe they can keep it up. We'll see. Trey Turner's out for a while, which is not great. But the guys coming up to replace him have been very good. So hopefully they can keep it rolling. We'll see. I don't know. I'm sure at some point. It doesn't feel like the Eagles last year where they started 10-1 and then collapsed. Because during the 10-1 run, they didn't look quite right. They were still winning because they just have so much talent, but they never looked quite right. And that's not what the Phillies look like. The Phillies look good. So I'm sure it won't end in disaster like every other year. We'll see. At least the Braves keep telling me that being the best, winning the divisions and getting the 3 days of rest or whatever, a week of rest is the worst thing that could happen to a baseball team. I think it's more that they have to play us after that. And that was the problem that they had. But
I think the worst thing that can happen as a baseball team is being the Colorado Rockies, but yeah.
Yeah, they're the exact. So we got opposites because the Rockies are the worst in the MLB, right?
Yeah.
Which is impressive considering what the A's are.
Yeah, the Rockies said, "Hold my beer," and decided to stink it up.
I would not have predicted that anyone could be worse than the A's this season. The A's don't even have a future. Aren't they moving to some small town before they supposedly go to Las Vegas? I don't know. What a mess that place is, but they're still playing better than the Rockies somehow. Pretty funny. All right, well, yeah. So. We'll see how that goes. By the way, the game boarding convention that I went to at the senior center last week was great. I had a lot of fun. Highly recommend. It's called Congress of Gamers here in DC, but I'm sure that, I'm sure everywhere has something like that. So if you ever get once you're old like me, get older, you can get into adult board gaming. Which sounds weird. That sounds, not right. It's just board games for adults. And so it's fun, but yeah, I enjoyed doing that. Hopefully do some more maybe I'll board game this weekend too. We'll see, but Arboretum first. Hopefully it's not too steaming hot here in DC. It's been back and forth. So I don't know what this weekend's going to be like, but I hope it's not too hot. But yeah.
Greenhouse within a greenhouse.
Yeah. But that's all we've got for you this week. On the interview podcast, we actually have Kevin Williamson from the Dispatch. I was on Dispatch Live earlier in the week, and so he joined our show. We had like a whole crossover thing going on with those guys. We republished one of his pieces on the Washington Post and their sort of AR-15 mass shooting graphic images expose and his problems with it. But we mainly talk about the state of the gun rights movement. And I think it's a good episode. So you guys can catch that when it comes out on Sunday if you're a Reload member, because you get early access, and then Monday for everybody else. Of course, if you want to support the reporting we do here at the Reload, you can buy one of those memberships. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you won't find anywhere else. You'll get the podcast, the interview podcast, day early, and the opportunity to be on the show if you want to in a member segment. So head over to reload.com, check that out today. That's all we've got for you this week. We will see you guys again.